the reason I'm saying it like that is it because it could have actually just been given in dialogue, right? There could have been a bar scene.
So much less interesting.
So much less interesting. But sometimes people do this, though, where they realize that the exposition should be the story. This episode is being brought to you by ScriptUp, which are expert story and script consultants. They're listeners of the show, and they reached out to us and demonstrated.
Being fans helped their cause, but what got them across the line is the fact that they offered us use of their services, and you and I just finished a script that we needed independent feedback from. We got an amazing detailed report from them, but for me, what most sort of coverage and competition and feedback services lack is that actual back and forth and to and fro on stories. And ScriptUp builds into their feedback an actual Zoom call, which was fantastic.
So if you're looking for an experienced, independent insight into how your story is working or not working, consider using ScriptUp.
Yeah. And they don't do any of that promise of access bullshit, like if you pay us X number of thousands of dollars, there's a chance that we may just circulate your script to blah, blah, blah. So they're just about making your story work.
And if you tell them that Draft Zero sent you by using the promo code DZ10, as in the letters D, Z, and then the number 10, you'll get 10% off. So, look, just see the link in the show notes with the promo code in there.
And now for Front Matter?
Isn't this the front matter? Hi, I'm Stu Willis.
And I'm Chaz Fisher.
And I'm Melanie Killingsworth.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where three Australian resident filmmakers try to work out what makes great screenplays work.
And today we're trying to work out what makes great interweaving timelines work in the scripts of Destroyer, the Karin Kusama directed, Nicole Kidman starring, Hay and Manfredi written script. The Social Network, directed by David Fincher and written by Aaron Sorkin, and the Greta Gerwig 2019 version of Little Women.
I'm just going to say, even though it's today, this is actually going to be a 3-part series. We're going to do a episode per film, because otherwise it's going to probably get a little long, because Mel, being Mel, has got like 1,000 pages of notes.
So hopefully with each film we will build, because each of the films do things differently. So each of these episodes will stand alone as an analysis of how each film uses interweaving timelines and what the effects are on the audience. But hopefully each episode we can compare and contrast what we've learned before, building to the epicness that is Little Women.
And Chaz, what do you mean when you say interweaving timelines?
Thank you for asking. In Draft Zero, we've done lots of different podcasts on narrative point of view and like white space on the page and how time can work, but we're talking very specifically about the scenario where you're presenting two different timelines but with the same characters in them, right? So very specifically. So we're not necessarily talking about anthology films where different stories might be in different times, might be overlapping. Like an example might be Cloud Atlas, where you've got different stories in different times where they're interweaving. That's not what we're talking about here. We're wanting specifically to talk about the different, like the narrative tool of presenting your story, like arguably a single story, out of chronological order.
I think it's not, for the examples that we've chosen, I don't think it's so much that they're told out of chronological order. It's that there's an A plot and there's a B plot. One of them which may be in the past and the other one in the present, or one of them that's in the present and the other one in the future. But there's an A plot and a B plot featuring the same characters at different points in their lives, different timelines. And those A plot and B plots are then kind of interweaved or intercut in terms of how that narrative is presented to the audience.
Yeah. Is that a fair summary, Mel, of what we're tackling? Is that what you understand, the homework that we've set you?
That is great. And I was trying to explain this homework to somebody, and it took me like 3 minutes. So that was actually fairly concise.
I still think we've been recording for about that long. So
I'm just going to use some terminology here up front, kind of some tools that we can talk about. So one of them is the difference between a story and narrative, or story and plot. There's different people think of it differently, but there's the series of events in a story, and there's the way that those events are told to an audience, right? And so you can think of this is the story, and then there's either the plotting, or you can think of it as the narrative, the kind of the narrative approach. And there is this argument from many times guest of the podcast, Stephen Cleary. He talks about the idea that basically you've got to limit the amount of complexity in a film, right? In a feature, because of length. And there's a reason that we didn't look at it something like True Detective, even though in seasons 1 and 3 absolutely use these interweaving plot lines.
Westworld.
Or Westworld. There are a lot of TV shows, even like Big Little Lies. Big Little Lies. Pretty sure that had that. Like, it's a fairly common device in television, but the length kind of changes the issues. Because in a feature, the limitation of the kind of like 2-hour running length means that you can only be complex with characters, complex in narrative, or complex in kind of plotting the series of events. You can use other terms. It's like some kind of like linguistic algebra. So if you're really complex with narrative, then you don't have as much airtime, or you don't giving as much oxygen or screen time to other elements of the story. So I want to talk about that idea because of what I think is the reason we're doing 2019 Little Women is that we are very lucky that it's based on a novel, and there have been many adaptations of that novel. And they made the choice in 2019 Little Women to tell the story of 2 books as an interweaving storyline. And we're going to compare that to the 94 version. And Mel, I think, has seen all the adaptations and the stage plays, and read the book, and read the comic book adaptation, and read the picture book adaptation.
There's a great anime version. Yeah.
There you go. So like it's kind of a little bit of a control group. The other thing I want to talk about, also referencing Stephen Cleary, is he's got this idea of the hierarchy of knowledge, which is this idea that every time that there is a cut, right, like a break in the image, the audience asks these questions every time, which is, where are we in time? Where are we in the world? What is happening now? What has just happened? And when we got the answers to those questions, we contextualize those answers to use it to understand motivation and character. In other words, what are these characters feeling, and then how do I feel? So that's kind of the order. Where are we in time? Where are we in the world? What is happening? What are they feeling? How do I feel? Mm-hmm. And the thing is, most of the time, if it's just a cut within a scene, you know exactly where you are in time, or that time, little tiny time jump doesn't bump you. But what is interesting is when a cut doesn't work and we have to reorientate ourselves with geography. We've all seen those movies that are just kind of like Sound and Fury signifying nothing. That actually kind of takes us out of those films. So that hierarchy of knowledge, for me, is going to be a tool to talk about Interweaving Timelines.
And you have a lot of opportunity to ask yourself those questions in these films, particularly in the 2019 Little Women, but really in all of them.
I'm going to raise it as an example of how that can be challenging. I'm already going on a tangent before we've got to the first fucking film, but
So is that really a tangent?
But the first time I watched Cloud Atlas, I was super excited. I was in a cinema, and I remember like almost for the first half an hour, I was struggling with the film. I was just like constantly going, who am I watching? What is going on? Why are these connected? Why am I being presented with this? I was just asking question. And ultimately, I then had to almost consciously in the first viewing experience, just let go. Just go, you know what? I'm going to sit back and let this film wash over me and see how I come out at the end. And I came out loving the film, and I've rewatched it many times, and I've subsequently read the novel, which has a different narrative structure rather than interweaving. But it just goes to show that, I mean, that movie is, God, it's almost 3 hours. And that's a movie that tries to be both narratively complex, often within the stories, some of them have complex plotting, and aim for character complexity. And as a result, A, it has to be 3 hours long, and B, it takes work to engage with it.
Sometimes I do this thing where when I'm watching a film and I'm confused, I think, look, everyone is in the exact same boat that I'm in now, and the filmmaker knows this. And something like Cloud Atlas, at some point, you either have to say, I trust these filmmakers, and I'm going to push through, or at some point, sometimes you go, no, actually, they don't know what they're doing with it. But I always tell myself, I'm like, look, everyone else in this theater, everyone else who's watching this is having the same experience. I'm not the only one.
So, yes, sorry, I just realized I started speaking to take control of the conversation and then had nothing to say, and I'm now talking in order to not give it up.
All right, well, before we jump into Destroyer, I might just quickly talk about the challenge that was recently set us on the project that Stu and I are co-writing, which was we had not a long first act, but it is a genre piece, and the genre elements only started to kick in around page 12. There's we talked about it in the Midsummer episode. It's a folk horror. The city slicker protagonist only gets to the rural community around page 12. Right? And we'd had feedback from a couple of readers saying, just start in the rural community and do the stuff that you've got in the opening in flashback, like interweaving the timelines, right? And admittedly, I threw together a version. It was very quick and not that well thought through.
Well, it didn't have any magic stew touch.
But as I was writing it, and you confirmed it in your read, it felt like the audience experiencing the exact same scene in flashback, it would feel diminished to them than if they were being presented it kind of in chronological order. And so all of these films very successfully present flashbacks in a way that don't feel like, oh, I'm sitting back and watching a flashback. Oh, this is like expositing why something is about to happen. So I think the challenge for me is to kind of learn that tool better.
It doesn't work for every story either. Like, some things it's just better suited for, but even things that it is suited for, it's still fucking difficult. If it weren't difficult, everyone would do it.
So there's two things that I want to point out from there. One of them I'm going to put on the board, but I'm not going to break down exactly now. Is I don't think necessarily these films are flashbacks, use quote-unquote flashbacks in the way that we think of them. Perhaps even something like the way Manchester in the Sea is using them. Right? They are, but perhaps it's also running length, that when you transition to those timelines, maybe it's as simple as that, as much as I said I wasn't going to answer that question. Like, it's not flashing back and playing like a snippet of a scene. It's like, we are spending a decent amount of time. I don't know what that amount of time is before it stops feeling like we're just flashing back to see something versus, we are now in a different parallel timeline. The other thing I want to say is this topic came because Jack Smith, who's one of our Patreons, wrote to us about the BBC's new War of the Worlds TV show. And we haven't done the show, Jack, for previous mentioned reasons. But he asked, it sounds like in their adaptation, they did the idea of moving between two timelines as well. And he said, I don't understand that in this, his argument of this show is it splits the narrative between two time periods and completely undercuts the tension of the main storyline in both of them and makes them I'm never really present. So why does it work in some stories and not others? And then he's proposed the thesis. So we're actually using Jack's thesis, which is if you're going to tease a future point in the story, make sure it raises questions that the audience can only have answered by continuing to watch. I'm going to take that further and says, in a way, it's actually not about the future point in the story. It's always about the past. And I actually think it's, so if you're going to tease a future point in the story, make sure it raises questions that can only have answered by continuing to watch. If you're going to have a future, which I would actually argue is the present, make sure there are questions that are raised that can only be answered by watching the past.
It's the present in our three examples, but you do have films that do it in the quote-unquote future.
Yeah, like, I mean, the Limey, again, is not something that we looked at but I would argue that that's much more, like, non-linear as opposed to here are two very distinct timelines that we are moving between.
Well, I was just going to raise another example of Jack's point where I found Interweaving Timelines undermine the experience for me, which was The Irishman. I do not see what the old man, like cutting back to the interview with old man De Niro in the nursing home, added by intercutting it throughout the film. I can imagine it as a powerful ending at the end, but to me, it undid any plot tension. He is never going to die, right? And a lot of the early film is dealing with like the danger of this world. And I'm like, well, it's not dangerous because he lives, or not dangerous for him specifically, right?
And that may be a character investment thing, because I think the question it's meant to be asking is how did this character end up alone? Yeah. Right? But it doesn't have a clear enough articulation of him being in a world, because from memory, he's kind of alone at the beginning. Yeah. and then he joins them. And so we don't get enough clearer idea of it's someone who's having his family stripped away. But
Stu, tell us why you wanted to do Destroyer first, while I pour myself a beer.
let's play the trailer.
Who is it?
No ID, no idea.
I know your whole story.
Placing our agent undercover should look right enough next to our guy.
If we do this, we accept the consequences. Do you love me?
You know I do.
You chose to play cops and robbers. And you lost.
No, you cops!
All right. So, Destroyer is a neo-noir crime film. As usual, I'm going to
Pushes all my buttons. All my buttons. Neo-noir, like, female detective, fucked up.
Female director.
Female director, yeah. And I've seen some interviews with her. It's fascinating. But yeah, that neo-noir aspect of it is absolutely my catnip.
Yeah, it's definitely like a riff on the Michael Mann approach to crime films. Anyway, so in essence, it's not, I want to call it the log line, but it's following a undercover police detective, which is Erin Bell, played by Nicole Kidman, who takes revenge against members of a gang years after her case was blown when she was undercover. That's kind of the idea. So the reason I want to start off with The Destroyer is that this kind of crime movie, a mystery, is probably the most common genre where you see this kind of parallel timelines. That you have an event in the present and you flash back into the past to find out what happened. Reservoir Dogs does it. Memento does it. I mean, True Detective, we just mentioned. True Detective 1 and 3 do it. I'm sure there's others that I could think of as well, where essentially there's something in the future and then we're flashing back into the past, because crime in so much is about the past. Anyway, like as a genre, it's very much those kinds of mysteries are concerned about the actions of the way that the past impacts on the present.
Well, if you think about any detective story, it is uncovering how something that has already happened and why.
But what's particularly fascinating is that a lot of the detective stories use one of two, like, for example, True Detective, they use one of two techniques. They use a voiceover, which a lot of classical noir uses, or they use that, like what True Detective does, where they're doing the interviews and they are cutting between the interviews and whereas Destroyer does neither of those. So that's what really fascinated me about the script, is that they did that neo-noir thing and they sort of jettisoned either of those techniques, which classical noir, lots of the voiceover, neo-noir, a lot of the interviews or the like sort of clearly talking to a detective or having a sort of narrator, and they don't do either of those things.
Yes, I mean, The Usual Suspects does exactly the same thing. The interview with arsehole man.
Is it Chaz Palminteri?
Yeah. I'm talking all about Kevin Spacey.
Uh-huh.
Like, there's lots of that, like, oh, we're going to interview this suspect and we're going to flash back. And then, and then there's questions about reliable narrators or not. Yeah. And they do create a very simple, that kind of, which you'll look at The Social Network, that kind of interview combined with underlying, like, here's the interview and then the actual events is a very common structure. Mm-hmm. Let's just, to go further into the story, because obviously spoilers ahead and you need to understand there's events.
Hey, Belle, look, this is handled.
What is this?
What, you want us?
Yeah, come on.
Shot 3 times at least from the exit wounds right here.
What's that?
38 dropped at the scene. Maybe a ghost gun. No serial, no prints. No witnesses yet. Look.
Am I wasting your time?
City's time. You have no role here. That's our scene.
Who is it?
No ID, no idea. There's a few of those, blown dye pack. We're waiting on tech.
So basically, in the present, Erin Bell arrives on the scene of a murder of a John Doe, and then there's the officers there, and she says, I know this person. I know the identity of the murderer. I know who did this.
She picks up a stained $100 bill off the body.
Stained from a dye pack. And that sets her on a path And then we start going back to see the events because she starts basically kind of like a revenge film, hunting down these gang members that are teasing her. That Silas back, and then the central dramatic question is, what did Silas do?
Yeah.
And then we cut
Silas.
back to the flashback, and that Silas. And as we've talked about, there is this relationship between, as I've been kind of arguing, there's not just the audience understanding relationship to the character, the point of view to character, there's point of view to text. Yeah. So the text is telling us by flashback, there is a reason we need to be watching these flashbacks.
I don't think you're aware for a while in Destroyer, at least watching them, that they are, which is what makes it fascinating.
So in Destroyer, the big twist is that the opening scene that you see is actually a third timeline.
Can you give us 1, 2, and 3 timelines?
Sure. So the opening scene is the day after Silas's murder.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of what we feel is the present is her tracking down Silas to murder him. Spoilers. And then the third timeline is her as the undercover cop.
17 years earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the only reason why I say the third timeline is that the film very deliberately tries to manipulate you into thinking there's only 2 timelines and then reveals at the end that there was a third timeline. So that opening scene then folds into her so she sees a tattoo on the back of the John Doe that we then cut to her, well, not cut to, it reveals that she had the same tattoo and has had it removed. So we understand that she and the John Doe are connected, and she goes and to the FBI and says, Silas is back. He's sending me a message. I'm going to track him down. So the present day story is her tracking Silas down, and the flashbacks are about why is she who she is? Why does she need to do this? Why is she making the decisions that she's doing? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, so it is completely fair. I approached, actually, what's fascinating, maybe, to listeners, I approached all these things very differently. So you mentioned the tattoo, right? In the script, the tattoo that she sees on the dead body is page 4. We see a scar on her neck on page 7.
Okay.
We don't see her actual tattoo till page 80. So it hints that it might have been the same tattoo, and then it finally makes that subtext text. So but the script does a really interesting job of feeding the reader. Okay. Because, I mean, draft 0, right? Where I approach this very much from a writing standpoint, this script. The tattoo is laid out there at the beginning. I tore the script apart, and I had a lot of fun with it because I think the script is written. So the script was written by 2 guys, so it's a writing team, but neither of them who directed. They produced it, but they didn't direct it, but they work in concert with the director.
One of them is married to the director.
Yeah, right, one of them is married. So they were all clearly working closely together. But what's really interesting to me is this script, look, this is really subjective. The script feels like a script that is meant to be read by a producer or someone who might buy into it. It is really clearly the script is giving us the breadcrumbs that the film initially or eventually will give the viewers. So it's trying to give the same effect to the reader that the finished product will give to the viewer.
Yeah.
And that's what it's not written by someone who's like, oh, I'm going to direct this and it doesn't matter if a reader gets it or not. I'm writing it for me, which is a little bit what Gerwig's script reads like, which is fine because that's where she was in her career. But I think that's a very different prospect to where this script is.
Yes. Coming back to your scar, I just watched the scene. What's interesting about the design choice they've made is it's 3 dots like an ellipse on the back of his neck. And the scars on the back, she's had the tattoos removed, but they're literally 3 dots. So visually, it's effectively saying that she had those scars.
It's visual, but it's thematic as well, right? Like it's literally an echo of a past life, which is really fascinating to me. Like it's giving you the idea that this is something she's tried to erase, that she has tried to get rid of, but you can't get rid of the ripple effect. You can't get rid of the echoes of that past life. And we don't know until page 80 how she got it. Did she get it from the cops when she tried to join beforehand? Did she get it undercover? Did she give it to herself? We don't know how she got it. So that is still a question until 2/3 of the way through the script. Yeah. How did she get this is still important to the overall plot.
The reason why I was making the observation is that one of the things you said, Stu, about potentially what can I learn that didn't work in my project is it actually spends a lot of time in timeline, what the audience perceives to be timeline 1 before the first flashback, the first real flashback to her as the undercover cop with the FBI undercover agent getting their backstories straight, right? So Chris, thank you. So there's quite a period of time where you're settled in the first story before it goes to the other timeline.
8 minutes. It's about 8 minutes, and it's very clearly set up because she goes to the FBI with the banknote, the guy who was her handler. So we know, like, we get all that information, the exposition about, you know, this Silas. Oh, she was undercover.
What happened was we put you and Chris in there. 2 grand, a shit deal. You weren't ready.
Now we go to the kind of her practicing the stories from a character that we haven't met at this point. So it raises the question of who is this character? What does he mean to her now? Where is he? Are we going to meet him? And that's an important thing to note.
How'd we meet?
We were both at the bar trying to order. A Dire Straits song came on the jukebox. You screamed and put the shit on. I turned and confessed.
We said it was a Pink Floyd song, Chris.
Well, fuck that. I like Dire Straits.
In the present day, she's got greyish, shortish hair. She's very, you know, got the face of a drinker. And then we cut to her in the past. They put a lot more colour in her skin tones, but
freckles.
Most importantly, she's got long hair and freckles, so we know where we are. And they just do it between 2 close-ups, right? They haven't tried to, which is something that The Social Network does similarly, right? They actually make a pivot around the people, which I don't think Little Women does as well. I mean, this is not an episode about transitions.
They do it 3 or 4 times, but generally they don't.
You know, and what's interesting, so in other words, Destroyer is motivating, at least its first cut is about what's happened to her. How is she turned into a drinker?
Yeah.
Right.
Or a wreck of a human being. So like, let's set that up at the very beginning. She's like struggling to walk in a straight line.
I love I love Kidman's physicality.
Oh yeah.
I think it's wildly different. But for me, I immediately buy into that premise because noir.
Yeah. So
all of this is questions, right? And ultimately, this structure, this kind of parallel timeline, is about changing the kinds of questions the audience asks, right? And it does make it a little bit more, or can make it more of an intellectual experience. It's going to be interesting to come back to that to Little Women, because the thing with that hierarchy of the knowledge is because they're very much intellectual questions to start, you're playing catch up.
Yeah. So just to, again, some lessons that I'm taking from Destroyer is, first of all, it's established the first story that it's telling, and thus like the stakes.
The murder mystery.
The murder mystery is there is a murder mystery. There is a person that we think or she thinks is responsible, and she's going to track him down. But importantly, there are still plot stakes in the first timeline. Mm-hmm. Will she uncover the murderer? Will she track down Silas? What kind of physical risk is she at? There are still plot stakes. The flashbacks do not undermine the plot stakes. And then,
in fact, the flashback in the first act, I don't think have plot stakes. At least the first 2 about her.
It's character.
Yeah,
it's character. It's her and Chris. Because what we quickly get the idea, because like the button on the scene with Chris, who has her offsider in this, is they basically have to fake a kiss, right? To see if they can get away with being boyfriend and girlfriend. And there's clearly like some chemistry between them. So you're like, oh.
Think you can fake liking that?
Probably, yeah.
And the way it's structured is it's more or less the inciting incident. So it's like a meet cute. And then they get into the gang. So you get all that really cool, tropey, undercover stuff, you know, which is how do they get into the gang? Will they pass the initiation, et cetera, et cetera. But the flashback means that there's this sense of dread, right? Because we know something has happened in the past.
Because she's like bubbly, perky, like in control, confident. And we know that she's become a wreck of a human being. So importantly to me, when you're having these interweaving timelines, the past timeline still has stakes because it's raising the question of what happens to her in the past that has resulted in her being this wreck of the human being in the present. And that's what to me was missing in The Irishman, right? Just as a way of contrast, is the present timeline, quote unquote, the bookending, the old man timeline, was not posing me a question that needed resolution in that one. Whereas here,
I think that's a really great contrast, and I think that does start at a script level.
yeah, 100%.
Oh, this is absolutely script level. And great choices. Like, the fact is, so the first person that she kind of visits in the present timeline that was a member of the gang was Toby, who's like, out on compassionate release. He looks fucked. He's basically dying. He's got a carer. When you see the film, it's really striking. And it's played in opposition to when you meet him in the past. So when you meet him in the past...
virile and really
funny,
confident and, like, you know, that sort of douchebag that you love.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of,
He's so well
he's
cast.
a douchebag, but he's great. He's fantastic.
It's all about what has happened to these people, what happened in the past. And that keeps you leaning forward. So whenever they cut back to the past, it's getting another piece of the mystery.
Yeah, I think the mystery is fascinating because we have the actual plot mystery, but the character mystery is another level that it's working at.
Yeah. Because just what I'm making clear here, and I've had to sort of think about these things because I'm writing a biopic as well. And when you're choosing like which real life events and in what order to present them, you're presented with these questions as well. Is that the fact that you know that she lives and has survived does not take away the stakes from the past storyline, because you know there have been really severe consequences.
Yeah, that's a great word. There are consequences. And I think that's something you'll see in Little Women as well. Like, we're seeing the consequences in Little Women 2019. We're seeing the consequences of choices, but we don't know who or what made those choices. So that creates a mystery.
Yeah.
We are always behind Detective Bell, right? Aaron Bell. It's an intellectual experience.
To get slightly Stephen Cleary on us, the present day storyline is consistently asking plot questions.
Yeah.
And the second storyline, the past storyline, is posing and answering character questions.
Yes.
But there's also...
I think the bank flashback does both, fascinatingly.
But there's also a subplot in the main storyline, the present day storyline, which is her relationship with her daughter, which is all about character, all about fleshing out her character motivations and her character stories and who she is and those kind of things.
Yeah. And so we know that she doesn't have a daughter in the past. So the question is when the daughter was born. And that is something that
the
is...
script makes it very explicit.
While you're looking for it, I'll say there's very early on, it says 16 years ago was when the undercover case was. And then it also says she is 16. So we are very clear from watching the film that she was conceived during the past storyline.
So page 7 is the first time her age is explicitly referenced. So she goes and meets her old mentor / boss. How's Shelby? How old is she now? 16. So it's the first of many times that Shelby's age is mentioned, grounding us in time. Yes, it's expositional, but it works because that's exactly the sort of small talk that someone you haven't seen in a long time is like, how old's your kid now? You know, blah, blah, blah.
Hey, how's Shelby? How old is she now?
16.
Incredible. Really?
I don't remember your kid's name. Sorry about that.
They use this piece of exposition, like we need to convey this piece of information. And then the subsequent line that she says is one of the best character beats ever. Pause. I don't remember your kids' names.
So he remembers her kids' names. But not only does she not remember, but she feels comfortable enough with him to be like, mate, I don't remember.
Yeah, she feels bad about it. Like that's clearly in the performance.
Of course.
It's just like she feels bad, but has not got enough like sort of social mores to like try and hide it.
Or is too drunk to give a fuck.
Yeah. But that's kind of what I mean. Like she doesn't have the wherewithal to try and be normal. Yeah. She just lays her flaw out there.
It's mentioned a few more times in the small text. The only other time it's mentioned in dialogue is when she says it to Shelby's boyfriend.
Are you drunk?
How old are you, huh? 23? 24?
The fuck do you care?
What do I care? She's 16. You ever heard of statutory rape?
The age of consent is.
You gonna tell me about the law?
I didn't talk to you. That's right. No.
Let's fucking go.
Let's go. Out. I don't care.
You don't care?
Yeah, bitch out with that badge, you drunk ass cop.
Get the fuck out.
She's underage. In your fucking bar.
But it's mentioned a few more times in the small text. It's also mentioned a couple of times in the scene headings in terms of every once in a while, if the flashback or the cut is too short, they put it in the title heading like 16 years earlier for the reader. But most of the time they manage to do it within the scene. And she does mention to her boyfriend, like, she's fucking 16, this is statutory. And then, of course, sometimes in the scene headings, then we're 17 years earlier, and you realize, okay.
Oh, they're in the scene headings.
I think there's one where it's 17 years earlier, and it's just because it's a completely dialogueless, completely where without that, I think we'd be a little bit lost because it's just a really short snippet. And when it says 17 years earlier, it's further along. I'm pretty sure, to be fair, I did this homework like a month and a half ago when I thought we were going to actually record this in last year. But it's before she's going to the bank robbery, before she's going to get her pregnancy test. And it says, as soon as we're far enough into the script as a reader, we know how old Shelby is, we're realizing what's happening with the timelines, and the script tells us, okay, 17 years earlier, and you go, oh shit. Shelby's 16, I can do math. This is between 9 and 6 months prior to Shelby being born. Mm-hmm. One of the things, if we're talking about this as a partner to the other two episodes, one of the things that the Destroyer script does more than either The Social Network or Little Women is actually, in the big text, talk about visual signifiers. So it talks about the tattoos, but it also says things about a certain character having longer hair, or a certain character having, extreme signs of age, or a certain character wearing a certain shirt.
And just a small observation, all the flashbacks are done in italics, which is something that I've actually, we used in Aurora because there's some flashbacks in that, and we do all the flashbacks in italics.
Yep.
Just to make a really nice, clear visual distinction.
Which will be very interesting as well, because the flashbacks are done in italics, and how Greta Gerwig decides to do it is she uses a different font color to distinguish her sort of timeline, so you can see it visually as well. So different people sort of do it different ways.
Or not at all in The Social Network.
Or not at all, which is very interesting when you're reading the script. But in Destroyer, they talk a little bit about the style of, the sofas and the weed and the cigarettes and things like that, so that clearly we're in the 90s sort of vibe. And
listening to Nirvana.
The script does that a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, the script, it's more specific about that sort of thing. So, for example, just to pick a random example, on page 67, the slug line says we're 17 years ago. It's clear for the reader that is, but it's indicating for hair and makeup, or as another touchstone, or just to make sure that the writers want it to be really clear visually. Silas has the same long hair as he had prior. So they give more hair, makeup, wardrobe, set dressing, and props signifiers than either of the other two scripts. That was it. That was my stray observation, though.
But I think that's set us well for The Social Network, which is the next episode in however many weeks it takes to come out. That, unlike The Social Network, in The Destroyer, we are, even though we're always roughly in 17 years in the past, right, it changes locations a lot. So when you jump back into the past, we're not anchored at a specific place, right? And Little Women, when they jump back into the past, it's generally at the house. In the future, they're generally not at the house, right? In The Social Network, they're either at Harvard or they're in their deposition. In Destroyer, they're in somewhere in LA. They're not in LA where they're going undercover, but it's kind of like California. But the fact is, when you go from an interior place to an interior place, you need to get orientated more quickly, coming back to that hierarchy of knowledge. So they need those indicators in order for it to make it easier for us to kind of orientate ourselves and jump onto character, right?
Yes.
Okay, so look, obviously what's interesting is we're kind of dancing around because we're trying to give you an impression of what the experience of watching this film is like. Because these are these questions. It's like, what happened in the past? Oh, there's a kid. Who's the father? Is it Silas? Silas or whatever his name is? Okay, it's not Silas, but she's got a romance going with that guy. But maybe Silas, oh, there's a bank robbery. What's the bank robbery got to do with it? So all this stuff in the past is making you ask all these interesting questions that are quite intellectual. What's happened to these characters? What's happened to her? You're trying to solve the mystery. So what are the key events? What you've got in the past is actually not that complicated to explain.
Or even in the present timeline. Both of them are very simple timelines. What's amazing about the story is how they bounce between them.
And how it makes us feel about characters. So in the past, I'm going to start with that. What has happened is Erin and Chris. So Chris is her counterpart that they go undercover with. And basically their fake relationship becomes a real relationship. They are romantic. We have to discover, the audience have to realize that they're in love. And they do that through body language. They don't just tell us. And Erin falls pregnant to Chris. Right? And then when we realize that, we go, oh, that's the daughter. But where's her father? Because the person that is being taken care of her is not Chris. It turns out it's her brother, but I remember watching it at the time and going, is that an ex-husband or is that an ex-boyfriend?
Is he her brother?
It's her brother.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. At some point it becomes clear, but yes.
I've watched that film twice and I presumed it was like a future partner.
It's because you're also in this mood of solving the mystery, what he means becomes something that's active, right? An active question, which is something that you have to control with these stories because it's that whole, there's a great article, speaking of breadcrumbing, about QAnon and its relationship with mystery and augmented reality storytelling that I'm going to share in the show notes. Because as a screenwriter, you're going to read it and go, oh shit, they're using all this stuff that we do when building mysteries. And there's this particular idea of people looking for connections. So we're looking for connections there. All right. So what are the beats? What are the things that we need to understand in terms of exposition? She started developing her feelings and had, they developed feelings, Erin and Chris. She fell pregnant. Then the next key bit of information is that the gang they're with, which is not a really sophisticated gang.
Silas is portrayed as like a cult leader.
Yeah, charismatic personality. They're planning a bank robbery. But this is not like a bank robbery like Heat. You know, this is cool. What I like about it is it's like the scale down, fucked up Michael Mann. So there's a heist that's being planned on. But then what happens is Chris and Erin decide to be partners in the heist and not tell their handlers about it and keep the money and run off. So that's another key plot point. But what happens in the robbery is that there's a teller who accidentally puts a die pack in with the money.
No fucking die packs in here, right?
And it gets died. And Silas basically goes to kill the bank teller and Chris goes to intervene.
FBI!
So Chris is Erin's boyfriend undercover and Chris decides that there's this excellent moment where they're looking at each other and she's like, we've got to let it go. Right, because you're going to break cover. And he breaks cover to intervene, and it fucks up, and Silas kills him. And it's this great shot, point of view of her, where you see Chris go inside the bank, you hear a gunshot, and then Silas comes out.
What I love about that shot, though, that shot is plot and character, because in that weird moment, it's trying to put... It does a really good job, and I think the script tries, but you can't do that without the acting. It's one of those things. You realize why she's in love with him, it's because he does it. That's a really crux point where he could either continue as planned or go and try to save the person, and it's fucked up and I mean that as a high compliment.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand she's the one who's convinced him to steal the money. He's the moral center. Yep. She's the destroyer.
Yep.
And she doesn't go in to follow him. She could have gotten out and followed him. Gave him backup, but he's done it by herself in her absence of choice there.
Absence of choice, but she knows she's pregnant.
Still a choice. Point. That's true.
But, right, so for me, that really complicates matters. Would she have done it had she not just taken a pregnancy test? I don't know. And I don't think, as viewers, I think we're meant to be conflicted on that.
I was not conflicted at all.
Okay.
She is still, maintaining her cover. She's the driver of the other van. They had a plan.
She's going to get herself killed.
I was totally on board her not going. I didn't feel she had a choice at that point. Like, I thought
No, she made the right choice, and I think that's the thing, as I agree. Like, you're with her and you go, this is an understandable choice. And then basically what happens is because their cover's blown, she dries off, crashes the van, hurting Toby, the guy we saw at the beginning that will lately be dying, and then she basically hides the money and escapes. That's all that we learn in the past. The reason I'm saying it like that is it because it could have actually just been given in fucking dialogue, right? There could have been a bar scene, so much less interesting. But sometimes people do this though, where they realize that the exposition should be the story, right? There is a version of this which is a much more of an action film in the present day, where we learn that she's got a daughter, she talks to her brother, and her brother's like, man, I can't believe Chris broke cover to stop that fucking guy. And she's like, yep, can't believe he did that, motherfucking asshole, left me a widow. That's it. That could have been the scene, right? Instead, they've decided to take that scene and put it in the past. The question is, what do we think? Obviously, we're going to be making shit up about what we would put in the writers, but what is the emotional effect of doing it in the way that they've done?
The other thing that they've done is chosen when to put those, like when to dot that information throughout the A plot. Because the A plot is also super simple to describe in words. She goes to one lead, Toby. He leads her to Arturo, the second lead. Arturo leads her to the Bradley Whitford lawyer. The Bradley Whitford lawyer leads her to Petra. By following Petra, she gets involved into the bank robbery.
Just to be super clear, the A plot that you're talking about here is the present day storyline, and this is a bank robbery that happens in the present day, not to be confused with the one that happens in the past.
Yeah. She kidnaps Petra. Petra gives up Silas. She finds Silas.
Sounds like SVU when you say it like that.
But it is that simple.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about the bank robbery is ultimately just gives her a bit of more information, which is, they're robbing banks now, so they've run out of money.
Well, but it's also, because it's in the quote-unquote present tense, you feel like Erin gets the shit beaten out of her, and you feel the danger because she is at risk. We haven't seen any future timeline of this. That sequence is incredibly tense and incredibly well shot. The scenes between her and Petra, when she's kidnapped Petra, she's making decisions to, like, part of the flashbacks are to explain Erin's compromised decision-making in the present. Like, they will line up, why is Petra trying to hunt down and kill Silas rather than trying to find Silas, the quote-unquote murderer?
And bring him to justice. Why is she not trying to arrest him? Why is she effectively prepared to let herself be a sacrificial lamb?
And why has the past made her the wreck of the human being, the poor mother to Shelby?
Karen Kusama, who directs The Destroyer. What's fascinating to me is, I think the fact that Fincher directed The Social Network is fascinating. He's a great director. The fact that Little Women, Gerwig clearly wrote it for her to direct, and it's phenomenally directed, but also she wrote it for herself to direct. The fact that Karen Kusama directs this script, you could really fly off the rails. Even though I think the script is very good, and I think the script signals on the page a lot of things. The script signals everything on the page in terms of timelines. It does not do very well signaling emotional or character beats.
Interesting.
And I think Karen really brings that to life. Obviously, the actors do a great job. Nicole's phenomenal. But in terms of directing, I think that the script does not give you a lot of that. Like, a lot of what you just said is director dependent.
To make an observation from someone who has not read the script, but listening to you, is that as screenwriters, they've decided to make the reader's job easy in terms of orienting them in time and taking those questions away about where are we, why are we watching this?
Yes. It's explicit. 17 years ago comes up constantly. The fact that where we are is signaled really clearly in the quote-unquote big text. It's very clear for the reader.
But they have not gone into directing character motivational performance on the page.
Not at all. Not at all.
So they're then letting the drama do that.
Yes. And I think that's what Karen really interprets very well for the screen. Whereas in something like, and I'm sure we'll get to it when we come to it, Little Women, it's done very differently.
You know, what I'm trying to articulate here is that they've got these series of events. They've come up with this idea. There is a version of this where they go, oh, it's really interesting. There's an undercover character story about a person who falls pregnant to their partner undercover, right? And then they decide to run away in the sunset. You could literally make a film about that, right? You could do a Thelma and Louise.
I've seen lots of noirs that are probably thinner than that.
Yeah, right? And they've taken that and they've made it the past to make it a story about how those choices have consequences on the present, and the present is all about those consequences. And the film does a very good job, and it sounds like the script does as well. But the Getzolt result in the film is that we see the consequences on all the characters, not just her, but everyone around them has seemingly been affected. Even her handler that we meet early on seems like that maybe because of the fuck up he's been demoted or something like that, or kind of been stagnant. Like, everyone's been affected by these decisions. We don't have the time to go and reverse engineer how they've decided to ultimately plot those events, but essentially what we're saying is by interweaving them, they're introducing the daughter, and then we go back and then we learn that she's pregnant, but also they spend time in the past. So there's actually a lot of character development that happens in the past. We would just see her making out with Chris. We see them making the decision, debating the decision, right? Coming back to our character motivations episodes, debating the decision about whether or not they go into it.
We returned to the house.
No one was there. We went to 2 locations we knew they were looking at.
And while we were at the first, they were already hitting the second. It was over before we got there.
We take full responsibility for losing contact, but
There was no forewarning. And we believe we did nothing to cause them to mistrust us.
Because we've got the mystery, and actually what's interesting about it to me is that we actually get more character because the interweaving timelines, because we know the consequence, means that they can actually spend more time with the characters trying to make those, understanding those decisions, and those decisions are filled with dread. Because we know that it does not work out for them. We don't know quite how it's not worked out with them. Chris could have lived, and that they did this money, and he fucked off with the money and left her holding the baby, right? Figuratively and literally, or vice versa. So it creates a whole bunch of interesting things. So I don't know what led them to the decision of doing it, and maybe it's just the way they conceived it, but it's made it a more richer and complex film by combining those two things, which doesn't always work. But that's because they inform each other on a thematic level, but also on a well, theme is, what is this all about, right? So theme is another, in that understanding of episodes we talked about, theme is another kind of audience question. Why am I watching this? Why are we intercutting these storylines?
And there's a few scenes in here that I think, from a script writing level, really almost only exist for theme. So I've heard actually conflicting viewpoints on the Russian roulette scene. And I think that scene exists almost solely for theme. It's about making you feel something, but it's really about the theme of, destruction for the wanton sake of it. And that's a scene that I think if you're saying, how does it serve the plot, blah, 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 you could cut it. But it's thematically relevant, and it like you were just saying, it builds the sense of dread, it underlines some of the characters, etc., which is what I think is really fascinating about the script in particular.
We've kind of been talking around this Russian roulette scene because it's like somehow we're afraid of spoilers. So let's just get into it. Like, what is this Russian roulette scene?
So it starts on page 49 of the script, if you want to read the script. It says, the past. So in the script, we realize we're in the past, and fairly soon, if you're watching the film, it makes clear we're in the past.
Hey, Toby. I think you're lost in the forest there, buddy.
I'm not lost. He's a searcher.
And the crew is partying, they're doing all these things. There's weed, there's coke, there's music, there's sort of like, there's some people making out. Someone comes in with a case of beer.
New soldiers, ready for action.
Yeah. And Silas picks up a gun that's sitting on the table, specifically a revolver, spins the barrel, throws it at Arturo.
Hey, Arturo.
Oh, what the fuck, Silas? What the hell, man?
Let's see if it's your time.
And then we cut to Belle's car. So as soon as that happens, the script, just for a moment, cuts away, and it says, Belle is driving south on the 405. We're on her face and then it switches into italics. Sound continues, music, reactions in the room, Silas, voiceover.
Let's go. Let's do it.
So the script is telling us that this is going to be a J cut. The script is telling us that the voiceover we hear is coming from the past.
For the audience that don't know, a J cut's called a J cut because the J is kind of the audio track starting before the video, and what they call an L cut means that the audio continues after you've cut away from picture.
And then the script, and now we're on page 50, interior gang house, the past night. So this is continuous with the scene that we had just seen. So, but we've jumped Belle in the quote-unquote present ahead to what we presume is the next morning. So she's moving ahead, but clearly this is occupying her thoughts for hours and hours and hours, and she's replaying this scene over and over in her head.
Let's find out. Seriously.
And then he mimes putting a gun to his head. You know, he wants Arturo to play Russian roulette.
Right? Well, come on.
Fuck that, Arturo. You don't have to do that.
This really doesn't concern you, Chris. This is about Arturo. And Arturo has free will. It's his decision. His.
And then in the film, we keep on kind of cutting away to Chris and Belle watching. You know, we're waiting to see whether or not they'll blow cover by intervening.
All right, let's just... come on.
That's it. Don't do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. You know? No judgments. No. Look here. Do it. And don't do it. Do it. Or don't do it. Oh. That's it. Oh. Fuck, man, you really have to stop letting people push you around. Right? It's a loaded gun, you fucking maniac.
It's a very tense scene. It's this scene that tells us a lot about character, and I would have to double check. I believe we've seen Arturo already in the quote-unquote present.
What's interesting?
Oh yeah, we have. Like it cuts
really?
from. It cuts from. If you scroll back up to page, this scene closes out Arturo in the movie. So she has just
No. It closes. I just want to point out it closes him out in the script, not in the film. They've moved it earlier in the film. I'm watching it
really?
now.
Okay.
It's before the first act. It's before we've met him.
That's a really interesting change then from looking at the script versus because
the script it's almost the midpoint, right? It's like 50 pages in.
It's exactly 50 pages in.
Well, let's just look at that in terms of parallel timelines because in one version, like in the script, you know that Arturo lives because she has just debriefed him in the main timeline that's in the future. So it's deliberately taken the outcome of the Russian roulette off the table, focusing the scene more on Silas. Who is Silas? Who is he as the type of person to force someone to play Russian roulette? And it's the first time we see kind of Silas's power as a sort of cult leader, like the fact that Arturo would even play Russian roulette. And the tension for me in the scene comes mostly from Belle and the other cop. What's the other cop's name?
Yep, her boyfriend. That's Chris.
That's his technical name. His boyfriend.
The boyfriend.
But
he's sexy and doesn't know it.
But the tension comes from these two undercover cops, whom the audience knows are undercover cops, are going to let him play Russian roulette.
We know they're undercover cops, but we don't know yet what has happened to Chris. A lot of the tension throughout the film comes from we have not seen Chris in the present. So we have no idea what's happened to him. So the tension around this scene revolves around A, what happens to him, and B, what are his and also Kidman's characters, what are their moral choices in this scene? So yeah, that is quite interesting that clearly they decided to focus more heavily on that by jumping things around a bit in the edit.
And so what's interesting is because it's her in the highway, they've been able to move it earlier. I'm assuming they've done it in the edit because essentially her in the car driving somewhere between scenes. Flashback, her driving somewhere, flashback, and they've been able to bring it earlier. I don't even know who Arturo was. Maybe I mentioned it by name, but names aren't necessarily the best way to recognize characters. I had no idea who that person was. As you say, I felt like there could be danger when I was watching the film because I was like, this guy could blow his brains out in front of these two. And it's a classic trope of undercover cop stories is that there's always that great scene where undercover cops have their identity challenged or put under pressure.
Will you do drugs? Will you watch this guy blow his brains out? Will you hit this child?
Yeah, but there's a cool button because basically does he do it in the script where Sebastian checks the revolver for bullets?
Yes, he does it in the script.
There were 3 fucking bullets in here.
Fuck, really?
He checks the gun and finds that there's actually been 3 bullets when he spins it. And it wasn't clearly shot intentionally. It's not clearly specified in the script, and it's not clearly shot how many at the beginning when Silas is playing with the barrel. And then he says, "Fuck, really?" That's the end of the scene. He winks at Chris, so he knows, but he's playing innocent.
Yeah. But by moving this scene earlier in the script, because you get someone says Arturo and you get a flash of young Arturo's face, but by moving it before Aaron tracks him down, chases him around, interrogates him, before we've seen him alive in the main timeline, you are immediately adding more stakes to the scene as well as retaining those character beats. The scene still keeps Silas's power as a cult leader over these guys. The fact that he uses 3 bullets instead of 1, it keeps Aaron and Chris's the test of them, because either way it goes, we don't know if this is where they reveal themselves and blow the undercover operation or if they stick it out. And so those character beats are kept the same, but by just moving it in the edit, suddenly there's plot stakes as well.
And it also makes you go, yeah, I can see why Arturo wanted out from that guy. Like it was an abusive relationship.
That scene does great work in establishing Silas.
Yeah.
Silas is a villain, and we're about to talk about the end of the film, but Silas as a villain is only really expressed to me, in that scene, and then in the scene where he shoots the teller and Chris.
I mean, yes, but also, do we need him to be established a villain before he shoots the guy? It might come as more of a surprise if we hadn't established the quote-unquote, stereotypical guy forces people to do his bidding, blah, blah, blah. I actually think a more stereotypical way would be for him to force, Belle and Chris to have sex, blah, 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 which is cliched, but it's a definite way to do it.
Oh, yeah. So,
right.
But just what I'm saying in terms of why Erin is prepared to compromise herself to track down Silas, it is important for the film to present us with why is Silas such an evil person or such an evil entity that Erin needs to track him down.
All he needs to do is shoot Chris for her, I think.
And I take it back. There's actually 3 scenes in the past. There's the Russian roulette scene with Arturo. There's him shooting the teller and shooting Chris. But then there's also something that they actually repeat right before the climax of the film is his one real key interaction with Erin in the past, where he's telling her that the rules don't matter, that no one is watching.
Look at that face. Hungry little mutt. You want.
What else are you going to tell me about myself?
You're a liar. You're a user. You want to be powerful. You want to be recognized. You want to be seen. But you can't do what you want. Why? Because someone's gonna see you and you're gonna get punished for doing what you want. I got good news and bad news. There's nobody fucking watching.
And it's kind of like, in a weird kind of way, that scene is so important because it's like that scene convinces Erin in the past to make the compromising decisions that lead to Chris's death, to her blaming herself, to her, like...
So Silas's death, he affects his own death, which is very Greco-Roman...
Classic tragedy.
So I think, just building on that, because I was just pondering it, is... And maybe this was something that emerged, that these parallel timelines work because they work on a thematic level, 100%. Not just in a pure... Like, we pick these examples, and a lot of those crime examples that intercut timelines, it is literally about just making the mystery of what happened more interesting. And there's nothing more frustrating. I can't remember what I watched recently, but I'm just going to get angry about it. I can't remember the name of it, where essentially it was like, it just feels like we're being withheld information to make it more interesting, right?
So they're cheating.
They're cheating. Yes, look, they've done from a writing point of view, they've plotted it and done a narrative in such a way to make it more compelling, but it's like all the characters know what's going on. And the only reason that you're not telling us is to make it more interesting, and it doesn't...
There's the relationship between the filmmaker and the audience.
What's the opposite of dramatic irony?
Yeah. But Destroyer feels like it's very much driven by theme. I mean, the theme is in the title. It's about the actions of the Destroyer and her temptation. And I think that's what's great. It's great noir because essentially what Silas reacts to is this idea that she's got this darkness in her.
It's my fault that he died. It's my fault that other people died.
What?
I'm not good. I'm the one who's bad.
Which is like, she kind of loves it, which is, great undercover cover trop. I mean, that is Russ Cole in True Detective as well, is that he is drawn to that darkness. But the reason I think True Detective Season 3, thinking about it now, in some ways I prefer it to Season 1, is because the interweaving timelines serve a real thematic point in Season 3, whereas in Season 1 they feel more artificial.
More narrative.
More narrative. They're more about keeping it interesting and exciting as opposed to, oh, wow, this is real complexity about the dangers of memory and, the narrative that we build to create a sense of justice and the way that is clouded by the present. Anyway.
Are we ready to get to the end? Because
yes.
So I did not like the end in terms of interweaving timelines, like the topic of this podcast. So Mel, would you like to start with why it worked for you and then I go with why it didn't work for me, or the other way around?
So what's fascinating to me is this film so I went in blind watching. I watched first, then I read the script. When I watched it and I got to the end, like the last 5 minutes, it felt the most to me like Inside Llewellyn Davis, which, for the record, is the only Coen Brothers film I do not like. I think that Inside Llewellyn Davis, by the time it gets to the end, is trying to be too clever, and it literally Ouroboros up its own ass. Whereas this film, I think, makes it work because it answers something for me in terms of the motivation and the plot, so it does the character and the plot thing. So, yeah, you tell me why it didn't work for you, and then I'll use that as a jumping off point.
Okay. So,
and by the way, can you be clear in terms of the end plot-wise versus the shot of like the skateboarders and all of that sort of thing, which is in the script?
100%. So, what happens is Erin tracks down Silas, and he gets one sentence out before she shoots him dead, and drops the gun, walks away. So, to put it clearly, I was already disappointed by this huge thematic and character build up to this confrontation that then didn't happen. Just to put it in context, I wanted more from the Erin and Silas confrontation.
More dialogue?
More anything.
Silas. That voice. Petra's not coming, is she?
No.
Get what I sent you?
Cut to a shot of Erin getting an envelope with the money with the die on it. and cut to the scene around the campfire where Silas is corrupting Erin.
There's nobody fucking watching. But I see who you are.
Cut back to old Erin and Silas.
You didn't get away.
So these are the questions that it started posing in my head. Why did Silas send her the fucking money so that she could track him down, so that she could shoot him? So suddenly I'm starting to get into, rather than investing emotionally in what is happening with Erin, I am thinking about Silas. So that's already a problem. But then what happens is the film reveals to us that Silas is the John Doe from the beginning. And then in my head, I'm starting to go, well, wait, when did timeline 1 become timeline 2? When did the story start? This is a very particular Chaz problem. I do know this, all right? Like, I'm someone who tries to understand intellectually films. But the fact is that the narrative of this film suddenly started me thinking about the narrative of the film to very little effect. They could have not started with the John Doe. They could have started with Erin walking drunkenly into the police station and pulling the $100 bill out of the envelope, which is when the current day story actually starts. And so the trick of the film gives me nothing, and all it did was make me start thinking about the film, not thematically or character, but just like, how the fuck does all this fit together? How does it make sense? And it alienated me from
plot
the film.
over theme and character.
Yeah, but not even plot, because it's not like the story. The stories that we've talked about, the plots of the past and the present are very simple stories. The narrative construct, the decision of the writers, right? So it got me thinking about the storytelling, not the theme, not the characters, not even the story, right? So it actually threw me so violently back out of the film that I was just like, I just wish they hadn't started the film where they started. If they just cut that whole conceit of the John Doe discovery of the murder, I would have had a more powerful feeling at the end of that film.
So I think the conceit is correct, like you using the word, that it is genre construction, right? In the same way that there's an awesome bank shootout as the midpoint. It's genre and expectation. That bank shootout is great. The plot movement of that is that she's been shadowing, can't remember the name, the orphan black, Petra. Gets involved in a bank heist, ultimately catches Petra and gets her to give her information. But ends up being like this 10, 15 minute like whole sequence. But it's a genre expectation that there's probably going to be 1 or 2 set pieces in a film like this. And that's one of the set pieces. Similarly, the opening with a dead body is classic noir mystery storytelling, right? And I think that gets you into the story in a way that like, oh, someone sent me a fucking died bill doesn't quite have the same level of stakes.
But then they could have started with an actual gang member with the tattoos that Silas has murdered. To me, making that dead body Silas undermined the potential power of the end of that film.
I'm trying to deconstruct, right? Now that I've heard Chaz's point of view, whether or not actually the way that it does it is correct is because of a noir standpoint, or because I've read the script, or because obviously, like, I love fucking noir, and that is a classical quote-unquote noir construction. Am I married to that? Or is it because I read the script? Or is it because I legitimately think that her walking, that I'm hung up on your quote-unquote solve? If she walks in with a noir bill, the first thing I think is, well, she's planted it. Which is what leads us to the actual conclusion, which I don't want to do as a writer.
Take away the solve.
Right, okay.
There's a gang member with 3 dots on the back of his neck who's dead. She goes, that's Silas's gang member. He's back. I'm going after him.
It's the dots instead of the money with the die.
I don't care what it is. The thing that bugs me is that they made this cyclical time loop, that the opening scene, so that at the very emotional climax of the film, when I'm supposed to be feeling the most and connecting to the most to the characters and to the theme and to the story, I was sitting back going, now wait, which scene came first? That is my problem. And I don't think it was necessary, and I don't think it added anything to the film to do it.
I think it reveals character, but I think it's a hard thing to reveal character because it puts us in intellectual aspect. Coming to the hierarchy of knowledge idea, in essence, what the hierarchy of knowledge is ultimately boils down to is there's intellectual engagement that we need to go through before we have emotional engagement, right? And so this time loop thing knocks us out, and then we ask those questions, where are we in time? And it means we don't catch up with why did this character do what they do? How do I feel? And then the kind of thematic idea is, what does this all mean? Right? And it's only later that it made me go, she is the titular destroyer, her. Because she murdered Silas, right? And the film starts like it's a murder mystery, like we're out there to capture the criminal. But once you've had the ending, you revisit the whole film mentally, and it's taken this doing Draft Zero to make me do it, not just now but earlier, prepping for it, where you got to read the whole idea that the events of the present timeline are not kicked off because Silas has re-emerged to hunt her down. They're being kicked off because she wants revenge.
It's a recontextualization, a reframing, however you put it. I love that.
But it's still kicked off because Silas contacts her. She doesn't suddenly 17 years on go, oh, I think it's time to track down Silas.
That's where I feel like the script digs at a human nature. So the concept of if you just leave someone alone long enough, if you just sit in silence with them long enough, they will say something. Silas was driven to fuck with her.
Yeah.
And that's
but then
shown
I'm thinking about
character-wise.
Silas, not about Aaron. On a film.
No, but I think he wasn't trying to just fuck with her. He was provoking her. It's the Russian roulette scene. He's provoking her to show a side of her, which is that she is not a good person.
Okay.
No, she's not. And he can't help himself.
Obviously this worked better for you two than it did for me. It also worked better for me.
You still gave it 8 stars.
Yeah, it still worked.
You actually gave it a higher rating.
It still worked better for me on second viewing than on first viewing because I knew what was coming.
And a lot of these films will, because you stop asking those intellectual questions because you know the answers, and therefore you experience them more emotionally. Social Network gets better to me every watch because I can dig more and more into those characters.
But I don't think either of you two would disagree with me that this whole time loop narrative choice that they make with the end makes it a more intellectual experience than an emotional one.
Absolutely. It makes it you asking, and thematic questions are, I think, intellectual. Look, let me take that back. There's the Stephen Cleary, as we've talked about in thematic sequences, idea of theme is what is this all about, which is definitely intellectual understanding. And I love Stephen, but he thinks of films more intellectually, probably because that's his job by nature makes it intellectual. But if we come back to our theme episode and theme and worldview, that's kind of this idea that it's a melody. Right, that's very different. But I think Erin is a melody in this film. And it does throw you out intellectually, but there's this idea that she is the discord. If she didn't decide to steal everything, the whole that single choice derailed everyone's lives around her. But she is unable to confront the reality of that, which is why she kills Silas. But I don't experience, because she doesn't go through agnosis. She doesn't have a moment of self-recognition.
I feel that she does. I feel like at the end of the film where she's looking at the bruises in herself and she's given the keys to the case to her partner, that is that. But we're not experiencing it with her because we're too busy fucking spinning cogs.
The Destroyer script, which I marked up quite a bit and which I will probably revisit, is really fascinating from a plot standpoint and from a thematic standpoint, but I think that Karen brought the character, Karen and Nicole, I'm sure, in conjunction with, brought the character to it.
Okay, so to cap that all off, to bookend it with an unnecessary loop that's not going to add any complexity, the description from the game designer was Apophena. As usual, I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly. So apophenia is the tendency to perceive a connection or meaningful pattern between unrelated or random things, such as objects or ideas. In their example, it was the idea that a bunch of people in an escape room started to think this random arrangement of objects was pointing them to the wall. So they literally wanted to break down the wall in this escape room.
Wait, sorry. How does this connect to Alfred Hitchcock's concept of the juxtaposition in editing?
I think it's different from the Kushelov effect. I think what it is, as soon as you start, like normally we assume that there is a juxtaposition between two images and that we're building meaning through the sequential juxtaposition of images, right? As soon as you go to parallel timelines, you are asking the question of, why am I watching these two parallel timelines? And if you don't give the audience enough, we're looking at good examples.
Yes.
But things that don't do this well make you go, why am I watching this timeline? Past time, and the answer is because it's shit, right? Like a version of that because they're trying to give exposition, because they're trying to make us feel something, and it's going to disconnect it, right? But most of the time, the audience will start engaging in that. So in the case of Destroyer, we are looking at why are we watching this backstory? It's in order to understand the present. The same is true with Little Women. What is interesting about The Social Network is that I think it feels different, that I largely think... look, as much as I said that they're all set in the present day and flash forward, it feels like The Social Network is the one that kind of feels like it's a flash forward.
Yes.
Not because of where it positions us emotionally with the characters. We are seeing the forward time, and it's also because it spends the least amount of time there, and it's kind of in some kind of effectively like a perjury, right? Like there's like a metaphysical thing that I'm sure Arian Sorkin could talk about, defending your life kind of thing. That is the framing device, which some people have argued it doesn't need, but I absolutely think it needs it.
I don't know if it needs it, but I think it benefits from it. I think it's better for it.
All right. So what have your guys' key learnings been from this analysis of Destroyer?
I really like the way that they are incredibly clear. And I think sometimes writers try to be too clever on the page. It doesn't need to be clever on the page to be clever on the screen. It needs to be crystal clear on the page to be clever on the screen. And I think that they've done a fairly good job of that by using different techniques. The one that Stu in particular noted with the italics, the things about being explicit about hair and clothes and music and things like that are playing. The thing like Chaz talked about in all the slug lines, it makes it really clear. They're clear on the page. And that most of that stuff we don't quote unquote see in the finished product. It doesn't flash up a 17 years later chyron at the bottom, but it's indicated in a lot of other ways. And it's able to do that because the director is always clear where they are at a glance in the script. And the script coordinator can keep it clear and the actors can keep it clear because it's on the page.
And they bold their slug lines like everyone should.
Absolutely.
I mean, I love bolding my slug lines, but I am not going to start getting prescriptive about this kind of stuff.
No, I'm not going to get prescriptive. I just know there's
in something like this, I think it's even more particularly.
Oh, I was going to. As much as I'm making a joke because there's a Twitter war about it going on at the moment, I actually think it makes things, which is why I like bolding my slug lines, because it literally helps orientate the reader in terms of where they are. Oh, we're now in a new scene. Therefore, I'm paying extra attention to the details, and it's a subtle visual cue that's what they should be doing. I actually have nothing to add. We talked about the narrative point of view. I was going to be like, I have nothing else to add to that, but I do, which is I'm just going to reiterate because I think it's an idea that will carry forward or try to remember. It depends how many beers I drink, which is narrative point of view. That what is interesting about these interweaving timelines. Interpolating timelines. That we are positioned at two different narrative point of, like we got narrative point of view positions with the same character at 2 points in time, and that gives us a complex understanding of the character that perhaps puts us even beyond, like ultimately the ultimate effect of that is that we get a really rich experience in a way that the character themselves probably doesn't have. The ultimate effect is that we know more about the character at the end than the character probably does. What about you, Chazicles?
like I repeated often, like, so this is because it's on my mind. Like I'm trying to write a biopic and I'm going to be interested to look at the next episode when we look at the Social Network. But part of the problem when you do interweaving timelines is letting go of stakes. And in the past timeline, when you know an encounter, especially in a film like this, where the stakes are life and death and you know that Aaron lives in the past. But what they do so well in the flashbacks is, like you said, Mel, they focus on the how, and that still creates stakes. They're often emotional stakes, or they might be physical stakes for other characters other than Aaron, but they are very much there. So the writers are so acutely aware of stakes in the past, and making sure that they're still present. But Stu, going back to you, because I can't believe we talked for so long in this episode without getting to narrative point of view. I could feel Stephen Cleary screaming at us. But you, like most, the quote unquote classic noir detective, you are mostly behind the detective, particularly if you go like, not even noir, if you go like Agatha Christie. Poirot always knows more than the audience and is making you lean forward. And I think you put your finger so wonderfully on the money that where there's so little of this film where you actually spend in empathy with Aaron. There are the, like you pointed out, the bank robbery sequence. But for most of the part, early in the investigation, we're going, what does Belle know that we don't? And then later in the film, the way that it's structured is, why is Belle making the decisions that she's making? We're so rarely actually present with her in a moment. And one of the points, I've already bagged on the like puzzle box element of the ending, but I think now that you've talked about narrative point of view, another reason why that doesn't work for me is because it's so quick. Like if they just sat and taken a beat so that I could be in empathy with how Aaron is feeling, being confronted with this man who corrupted her, and because of her corruption, she's become the destroyer. Oof. I just wanted to feel more in that time. And I, previously blamed it on puzzle box, but I think it's also on narrative point of view.
All right. So as we've been talking about this, I think we've kind of, it's not that we've avoided it, but it didn't occur to me until now that this is kind of related to narrative point of view. So we talk about narrative point of view a lot. I think I'm pretty sure our like third or fifth episode, I think it was fifth, was on narrative point of view. And it all comes from Stephen Cleary, which is that the audience has three positions related to a character, which is we can be ahead of the character, often known as dramatic irony, which creates sympathy, but also kind of tension. Oh no, look, it depends exactly what you're knowing. If you see the serial killer around the door and we see the character walk into it, we know more than the character. That creates tension. But there's other things that can kind of create sympathy or despair. And I think Little Women does that. As when we get to it, we'll talk about it. If we have as much knowledge with the character, in other words, if you experience the moment with the character, that creates empathy. And we actually talked about that in our How to Make Unlikable Protagonists not likable, but have the audience engage episode, because essentially you can spend a lot of time with an unlikable protagonist and we start to see, and because we're experiencing things with them, we'll tend to kind of empathize with them. And then you're behind the character and that creates a sense of mystery. Curious sympathy is what Stephen would call it. And then the fourth position is not knowing where you are in relation to time, and depending on the genre, that can create different kinds of unsettling feelings, often in horror. So he's got a whole thing about how those positions play differently in terms of genre. But I think my point in this is we're curious. We've got different, like we've got young Belle and we've got present day Belle or old Belle, and they're the same character. And therefore, we have got positions relative to them. So we are behind Belle in the present timeline. She knows more than us, but we're also ahead of Belle in the past. So we get this kind of juicy complexity in terms of character when it's used well, as it is in here, where you're feeling both mystery and this sense of like, oh, what's happened? Where are they going? Combined with this kind of sense of tragedy or sympathy for what's about to happen, or like, oh, don't do that. That kind of classic, like, oh, you're an idiot. Or, and I don't think this film does this as much, and I think Little Women, when we get to it, will play the empathy. I don't think there's that many points in this script. I mean, obviously stuff in the present day. Sorry, I take that back. things like her stumbling across the bank robbery, and that's the way that's almost played in like present time in the bank robbery, definitely is a position of empathy, but also makes you feel like the danger of it. Her relationship stuff with the daughter, even though we're behind with her and her daughter and her lover brother. like her finding her daughter and all that stuff kind of creates a sense of empathy with her. It's weird. I don't think I ever feel that much empathy for Belle in terms of that position of equal knowledge with her. I'm either always ahead of her or behind her. I get to experience the moment of, and this is a spoiler, like her boyfriend's death in the bank robbery with her in the past, because it stays so long in the past that we get to experience it as she did, right? And it is a surprise to us, but it's also this whole kind of like us catching up to what happened and therefore what changed her into the present. So we get that closing of like the difference between knowing less to her and then suddenly know we're equal in knowledge to her, and that kind of makes us feel a whole bunch of emotions. That's kind of, I think, one of the advantages of these kind of intertwining timeline structures, if used well.
And also the knowing what, but not the how, which is one of the things that's fascinating about, for example, to jump a little bit, Better Call Saul, right? So we know lots of what about characters in Better Call Saul, but not the how. There's also characters we don't know the what either, and that creates different. But with Belle and her boyfriend, we know certain things of the what. We know that she had a kid. We know that they were together. We know that he's no longer, etc. But we don't know the how. We don't know when. We don't know, was it because she killed him? Was it a moral decision? Was it a mistake that she made? We don't know the how. And every time it comes up, we're wondering, is this going to be the moment? So it creates a different type of tension.
Yeah, it's definitely a tension of like the information gap, which sounds so technical, but it's definitely the tension between something has happened and we don't know what. Like it's loading the spring, to use a metaphor. They were asking questions. But I think it's interesting because here it definitely makes ask questions about character. And I'm going to make, and this is a spoiler for Chaz, but I was thinking about this when I was watching it, which is in The Dry, which is an Australian crime mystery movie. It's essentially like a cold case from 20 years ago. It's not even a cold case. Like they think they have the answer, which is that a character's committed suicide. And there are implications in the present that it wasn't a suicide. And the investigative cop who was involved with the mystery of the past is like the two cases are connected, right? So it's got the timelines. But what's interesting about that film relative to The Destroyer is we don't spend a lot of time in the past. They're definitely flashes. They're the flash part of the flashback. Very different from this. It's like, here's the moment, the fleeting moment. Oh, he's in love, blah, 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 blah. But I don't think it really changes that much in terms of your narrative perspective of it, because I was like, I don't think they're going to, and maybe this is me being overly quote unquote literate in terms of the genre and stuff. I was like, they're not going to make it that the cop is the one responsible for the murder of this woman, and he doesn't quite know has gone on. But I don't know. I just didn't think its use of those positions was as sophisticated as in The Destroyer.
It wasn't, but also it's not meant to be a puzzle box the way that Destroyer is meant to be. It's meant to be much more about the emotional journey of the man who has left the small town and is now returning, played by Eric Bana. It's much more about his emotional journey and being forced to confront the ghosts of his past, as opposed to being forced to confront the actions of his past and how that echoes through the way it does with Belle.
Yeah, the consequences of it, because his consequences, his choices in the past, all they led to him was him being run out of town, as opposed to him actually being responsible, which is where I thought, I mean, you can cover your ear, Chaz, but that's actually where I thought it was going to go. It was going to be more about the way that men create excuses for other men that commit violence towards women, and it ended up not being that. So, which is disappointing. But I just think it's interesting.
It touches on it in the past murder, not so much the present murder, which I did find interesting. I'm glad that they resolved them differently.
Yeah. And past murder, what is interesting, when he learns the final denouement, and it is kind of a denouement, when he learns what happened in the past, we experience with him in the present as an equal narrative point of view. Anyway, I just think it's interesting because I reckon if you look back at some of the murder myths, because we talked about how crime films like The Destroyer can often use this structure, trying to undiscover the mystery, they won't be necessarily changing your narrative point of view relative to character. They'll be changing relative to plot. We now have caught up on the plot, we know more, but very rarely is it about changing how we feel about a character because we now either know more than them or behind them.
I'm talking about just before she actually shoots Silas. Like, to me, that is the point where I was like missing being present with her.
Talking about 2+2, this idea of you make the audience add things up and then that gives them like a charge, like an emotional kind of And that's so much of this film is like filling in the pieces. It is the puzzle box, but because it's to do with character, it kind of feels a little bit emotional. But I think the reason now coming back to like why I resisted the idea of the boyfriend, the moment where Chris goes into the bank and he's about to be killed. And it's like, yeah, we're experiencing it with her in the past, but we're not empathetic because we know that he's no longer around. Soon as he makes that decision, we are like, oh fuck, we are ahead of all these characters. Not because we're completely certain what happens, but we got a fairly good idea. We are doing 2 + 2 = 4. And therefore we're not in empathy with her. And in fact, when she's driving away with all the money, we know the outcome of that. So we are definitely ahead of her and there's a dramatic irony. But as soon as he talks about that in the moment of the bank robbery where he looks at her and he's got like, I'm going back in to stop this woman being shot, we are like, oh fuck. So yeah, you're right. We absolutely don't get positioned in empathy with her at all.
Well, can I just read the ending where she's just confronted Silas? I'm just going to be in 106 because as the figure stands, Belle and Vio, Silas, the figure straightens, calmly raising his hand slowly. That voice, Petra's not coming, is she? Carefully, he turns, coming into the light. Silas, older now, but with the same wild glimmer in his eyes, a hint of a smile. You get what I sent you? Wanted you to know that you didn't get away. Coming into the light, we can see him, that his head is shaved, that he wears a red jacket just like the body from the beginning, and on the back of his neck the tattoo that we saw on the victim. Belle keeps walking towards him. She has a gun. It isn't her service pistol, but the revolver with the red wrapped grip. Silas, you're still mine. Belle fires. Now, all of that stuff is underlined. So in the script, they're also going, hey, reader, this is the big fucking intellectual twist. None of it is writing, how does Aaron feel in this moment to be confronting Silas?
And then he's right. He still has her because his corruption is so complete. It is the throne room moment with the Emperor. Strike me down and I will become more powerful than you would ever imagine. He is literally saying to her, kill me, and you're proving what I said to you, which is actually you're a piece of shit.
So even in the script, the writers have made the decision for this to be an intellectual and not emotional moment. And
that seems like a good place to end. Is that what you're about to say today?
Yes. Yeah, you did. But that's okay. That's how we roll.
Thanks to all our patrons for supporting us and for making all of you get more Draft Zero more often. Special thanks to all our top tier patrons, especially Randy, Garrett, Sandra, Joachim, Krob, and Bjorn. We love you. Thanks.
I hope you all feel like arguing with either Stu or myself
about anything on this episode or anything in general.
And you can find many ways of getting in touch with us at our website at draft-zero.com.
At the website, you'll also find the show notes for this and all our other episodes,
as well as links to support us and spread the word for free via a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Very important for spreading the word.
Or if you think that what we do here is worth $1 or preferably more than $1, then you can also find links to our Patreon page to support us getting these episodes to you quicker. Thanks.
And thanks for listening.
And now for Backmatter.
The scene between Belle and Silas, there's this scene around a campfire. It's a really simple kind of scene where it's almost just like single shots on them. It's nothing super fancy.
You want.
What else are you going to tell me about myself?
You're a liar. You're a user. You want to be powerful. You want to be recognized. You want to be seen. But you can't do what you want. Why? Because someone's gonna see you, and you're gonna get punished for doing what you want. I got good news and bad news. There's nobody fucking watching.
The audience that are listening to this and haven't seen the film, because it sticks out when you've seen the film, is that they're playing close-ups of Bell and of Darth Silas.
Darth Silas.
Yeah, I can't say his name properly, so I might as well make a joke out of it. They're playing that dialogue over them in close-up saying nothing. So you're not sure if this is her remembering things that he said to her over time, or that we're getting access to, well, her inner thoughts, but also her imagining what he said. It's a very almost David Lynchian scene because it's very unusual to have audio decoupled in that way. You know, we're used to prelapse and postlapse. And here it's more kind of like, it's weirdly non-diegetic, but also diegetic because we're assuming it's from the story world. So diegetic means, I feel like we're doing a promo. Diegetic means of the story world. So music is, as we've talked about many times, a literary technique, but it's also it's also non-diegetic. Whereas diegetic music would be music that's playing on the radio or whatever. And so here it's this kind of playing around with our sense of time. I'm just curious whether it's in the script, because when I watched it, and the reason I wanted to ask about it, I was like, man, it feels like they've either ADR'd these lines, right, and just playing these really moody close-ups that they shot around the fire, or potentially shot as pickups, because it's like fucking, like you get no sense of space. They're basically against a black backdrop in this fire. They could have shot this as a pickup at the end of a day or end of the shoot. Like, doesn't even have to be another.
Well, the dialogue's in the script. The fact that they're around a campfire is in the script. Also, I misspoke earlier. The quick flash away to it earlier is on page 31, not 32. So 31 is the first time we see it. All it is a flash to them sitting around the campfire outside. No dialogue, no anything. Then page 59, and that specifies 17 years earlier. Then on page 59, it just says the past, and it doesn't specify that it's voiceover, but the dialogue is the same, and it does cut from Belle's house interior into it, but it doesn't specify that it's a voiceover. It doesn't specify, so it sounds like a directorial choice.
Can I say though, the intro to the scene in the action line, it says, we see them very close so that it takes on the feeling of a dream. That's the introduction into the scene. And the other thing that the technique does is it gives you the idea that they're actually reading each other's minds because they're having a conversation, and it does cut back and forth between their faces as they are, as the audience is hearing this in a dialogue, whether it's a conversation they've already had out loud at some other time, or whether it's like unspoken communication,
and the camera gets closer and closer between them. Like he is getting inside her head.
Yeah.
Like that is like visualized and audioized and cinematized.
So from where it's putting us in the story is it's showing us, oh, Silas is having an effect on Belle. How is that? And to me, it's not just posing a character question, because what effect is that going to have? How is that going to play out? Because again, the mastery for me of Destroyer and its interweaving timelines is it somehow manages to not undermine the stakes in either the main timeline or the flashbacks.
And that's a real balancing act.